When you think about tsundere girls, you might think of some of the classics, Makise Kurisu from Steins Gate, Nino Nakano from the Quintessential Quintuplets, or even Tiger Isaka from Toradora, but the most tsundere of all the tsunderes is none other than Louise Valliere from The Familiar of Zero. But before we talk about Louise's tsundere-ness, let's talk about the show itself. In short, The Familiar of Zero is an isekai based around a magic academy and its students. Louise is nicknamed Louise the Zero in her class because of her inability to perform magical skills and instead creating explosions. When her class is one day told it's time to summon their own familiars, which is a bit like getting your first Pokemon, each class member successfully summons their own creature as their familiar until it's Louise's turn. She instead summons a human boy from Japan named Saito. Saito struggles to adapt to this new world and now he has to obey Louise as her familiar and is treated more like a dog rather than a human being, at least in the beginning. So the story revolves around the two of them working alongside the other members of the academy, fighting against the enemies of the kingdom, working together with the queen to do so. The way I see it, there are two sides to this anime. You have the times where the plot is happening and the other times where it's in between storylines and it's more of a slice of life everyday antics with the characters. So the question of the video is The Familiar of Zero worth watching? Well, it can be an acquired taste. If you've ever watched High School DxD and liked it, well, this might just be for you. If you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing, and if you don't, Nino might slip something slightly questionable into your drink. There are many different genres here: isekai, action, comedy, adventure, romance, harem, ecchi. This can either be a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. The saying jack of all trades and master of none springs to mind. The plot is interesting enough to keep you watching, but it's not exactly RE0 levels of storytelling. The romance is alright, albeit very slow and often frustrating. The comedy is funny but often repetitive. I would actually say the show's strongest and most consistent category is actually its harem and ecchi features. As Saito becomes stronger as a fighter, he starts attracting his own harem of girls that are in constant competition with Louise for him. Whilst each girl doesn't exactly have a lot of development, there is enough there to debate who Saito should end up with instead of Louise, and debating the anime fandom is always a good thing, right? My personal favourites are Queen Henrietta and Siesta, but you know ultimately that he won't stray away from Louise no matter what temptations are sprung upon him. Now, Louise could be considered somewhat of a controversial character. She treats Saito as more of a pet than a romantic interest, and whilst this does change over the course of the series, she still tries to maintain a master and servant kind of dynamic to a degree. Why is this controversial? Well, when temptations from other girls come along, could you blame Saito for looking elsewhere to somebody who won't insist upon having a power dynamic in the relationship? And then predictably he'll get into a situation with another girl, whether it's accidental or otherwise, and Louise comes along and predictably explodes him and calls him a barker and a dog. So when a character like Queen Henrietta comes along, who has a kinder and gentler soul, who legitimately likes Saito for being him without having this power dynamic in their personal relationship, you kind of question why he would bother with Louise. The show tries to give us reasons for them being together, showing how they seem to have some kind of special bond with each other and how Louise can be cute in certain moments, but I doubt in many people's eyes that's enough to justify him not looking elsewhere. Louise actually has a lot of similarities to Tiger from Toradora, both are short flat-chested tsunderes who call their man a dog. I think the key difference between the two though is Tiger has a reason for her tsundere-ness due to the history with her parents, and she also matures over the course of the series and as a result becomes less of a tsundere. Louise on the other hand doesn't have such depth or growth to her character. Honestly though, this might just be me looking into it too much. Some people will recognise these things and won't see past it. However, if you're like me, I don't take these things too seriously or deeply and I just enjoy the series for what it is. And I don't actually hate Louise. I think the relationship with Saito is actually quite good. I like how their bond grows over time despite all of their fights, and they work together as a couple to save the kingdom. But as I said, their dynamic at times will rub some people up the wrong way. What I do like about The Familiar of Zero is it's a pretty good comfort anime. The predictability of the characters at times means you know what to expect from them. It's a bit like when you rewatch your favourite anime over and over again. There is a certain comfort in knowing what you're going to get from characters no matter what the situation they're in or indeed what the situation you're in, that is if you like the characters in the first place. So predictability can be a positive or a negative depending on how you look at it. My personal feelings on the series are that the positives outweigh the negatives. However, I was left frustrated at times. The end of the second season springs to mind. Warning, spoiler alert. Just before Saito goes to fight in a war, him and Louise have this sort of wedding ceremony where it's just the two of them stood in the church and they have this emotional exchange just before he leaves to go and fight. I can imagine going off to war and leaving your loved one behind and the pain of that, and I think the show conveys this feeling well. And then we see scenes of him fighting off the enemy, but ultimately it looks like he's fighting a losing battle. And then we cut to Louise back at the academy after some time, who's distraught because she believes Saito to be dead. But then over the hill, Saito emerges alive and well, and there's an emotional scene where they reunite and hug each other and fall to the ground in each other's arms. Not gonna lie, I did shed a tear or two at this scene. But then Saito explains how exactly he survived. he reveals that he did in fact die but was saved by a fairy, and then he goes on to detail how big this fairy's breasts were and how that they were bigger than most of the characters in the show. And if you had been watching up until this point, you knew exactly what was coming next. Louise gets mad and explodes him. I was so frustrated in that moment because we had this really emotionally charged and moving scene, but it was then devalued by what happened afterwards. Like, it would have been one thing if they'd have gone back to the academy after that scene, and then maybe they're in Louise's room, and then Saito explains how exactly he survived, and then he goes on to talk about the fairy's breasts, and then Louise explodes him. That would have been one thing, but I feel like the moment was ruined. However, if you're somebody who thinks the ending of an anime can make or break it, then rest assured the Familiar of Zero has a satisfying conclusion. As always with action anime like this, the final story arc is usually where the characters meet their biggest threat yet, and they have to use all of their powers they've gained up until this point. But Saito is sent back to Japan because there's a risk that if he uses his power it would drain his life energy and he would die. But in the last moment when everything looks bleak, he manages to find his way back to this world and he saves the day. There were a few questionable things with the plot here, the first being the slightly questionable explanation as to why he didn't die after using his power, and the second being a very coincidental solar eclipse happening that allowed him to go back to the world with the Louise and co, considering total solar eclipses happen only every 18 months. But I wouldn't think too hard about these things. So pretty standard stuff, but executed well. You can tell some thought and emotion went into writing it, but my favourite part about the final episode came after the action had come to an end. After 4 whole seasons with these characters and the ups and downs of Saito and Louise's relationship, it's really satisfying to see their proper wedding, albeit done in quite a short amount of time in the episode. And then Saito takes Louise to Japan to see the world in which he came from, and the final scene is them standing outside his house about to ring the doorbell to meet his parents. In this moment I couldn't help but think about what the hell his parents were going to say about him being away for that long, who this girl was, the fact that he'd been away in a different world and that this girl was from a different world, and just what the hell had been happening during this time that he'd been away. I'd have loved to have seen an OVA episode where Louise does meet his parents and maybe his friends. I feel like that would have been quite wholesome, but ultimately I was left with a feeling of satisfaction, which in my eyes makes it a good ending. And now that I've had a few days to digest my feelings on the series, I can honestly say I love it. I found myself missing the characters and the daily antics and wishing I could see more of them after the events of the series. Sure, it's not the perfect series and there are some flaws to it, but ultimately I did enjoy it. So to finish off the video, would I recommend watching it? Well, I would certainly suggest giving the first season a go, and if you enjoy the first season, you'll probably enjoy the rest. But if you didn't enjoy the first season, then I probably wouldn't bother carrying on. Thank you very much for watching.